Gig work has been controversial since the internet made it possible. On one side is the godsend of income for people who need it. They've lost their jobs, or they're between jobs, they're retired, or they need to supplement their existing income. On the other side are the claims of exploitation, the opposition by the companies that hire them to efforts at organizing, and the low pay for long hours. And now there's a new wrinkle, as these networks of people who perform tasks for a fee are being asked to share their identities and actions as training data for AI models. And this has some significant implications for communicators, which we'll explain in this short midweek episode of For Immediate Release.
Another fine podcast from the FIR Podcast Network.
This is For Immediate Release, the podcast for communicators.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 508 of For Immediate Release. I'm Shel Holtz.
And I'm Neville Hobson. Over the past few weeks, I've come across a set of stories that all point to something quite striking. Not just how AI is evolving, but how it's being built. Increasingly, the raw material behind AI isn't just data scraped from the web. It's us, our voices, our movements, our everyday lives, and increasingly, our identities. There's a new layer of the gig economy emerging. People are being paid, typically in small amounts, to record themselves, walking down the street, having conversations, folding laundry, even just going about their day. That data is then used to train AI systems, because those systems need examples of how people actually speak, move, and interact in the real world. In one case, delivery drivers in the US are being redirected to film tasks for robotics training. Platforms are turning existing gig workers like delivery drivers into distributed data collectors for AI. In another example, people are selling access to their phone conversations through apps that pay contributors to upload voice and text data. And in yet another, workers are strapping phones to their heads to record household chores so humanoid robots can learn how to move. The work is global, fragmented, and often invisible, with workers spanning Nigeria, India, South Africa, the US, and far beyond. Humans are no longer just users of AI, they are raw material suppliers. In China, there are even state-run centers where workers wear virtual reality headsets and exoskeletons to teach robots how to carry out everyday physical tasks. What we're seeing is the rise of what you might call data labor, where identity itself becomes part of the work. There's a clear driver behind it. AI companies are running out of high-quality training data. The open web isn't enough anymore, and synthetic data has its limits. So the industry is turning to something else, real human lived experience. Because if you want a robot to understand how to load a dishwasher, navigate a room, or interact with objects, you need to see humans doing it at scale. But there's an interesting contrast here. One of the stories highlights a 23-year-old in the US, a guy called Cale Mouser, who earns well into six figures repairing diesel engines. It's something he's developed great skill in doing. His work depends on judgment, experience, and problem-solving in the real world, things that don't easily translate into data. So while some people are being paid small amounts to generate data for AI systems, others, like Cale Mouser, are building highly valuable careers precisely because their skills can't be reduced to it. And that contrast feels important. Because on one level, this new kind of work does create opportunity. For some people, especially in lower income regions in the global south, this is real income, paid in dollars, flexible, and accessible. But there's another side to it. Because what people are actually selling isn't just time, it's identity, their voice, their behavior, their presence in the world. And often, once that data is handed over, it's gone. It's permanently licensed, reused, repurposed, potentially in ways the individual never sees or understands. So you have this asymmetry. Individuals earning small, immediate payments, while companies build long-term, highly valuable AI systems. Perhaps it's a new version of the mechanical Turk for the AI era. And that raises a deeper question. What does it mean when the inputs to AI are no longer abstract data, but pieces of human identity? When the training set is not just content, but behavior, voice, and presence? And when those pieces can be reused, replicated, and scaled, often without the individual's ongoing knowledge or control. Many platforms grant royalty-free perpetual licenses where workers get paid once and lose control forever. There's potential for deep fakes, identity theft, and misuse without consent. And perhaps more uncomfortably, what does it mean when people are contributing to systems that could automate future jobs? For communicators, this feels important because this isn't just a technology story. It's a story about trust, consent, transparency, and how organizations explain what they're doing with AI. If AI ethics lives anywhere, it's here, in how these systems are built and how that's communicated. So the question to explore, or one of the questions to explore perhaps, is this one. Are we comfortable with an economy where identity itself is becoming labor? And if not, what responsibility do organizations and communicators have in shaping it?
Oh, it's a big story with a lot to consider. On one level, it seems like the high-tech version of the sweatshops where high-end fashions were made, Nike shoes, for example, and people paying high premium prices to get those products while people who are making them are making pittances in these factories with long hours and terrible working conditions. And then you add on to it the identity issue. So it's something that I think, something at least I hope we're going to be talking about for a while. In terms of the AI element, what this suggests is that the gig economy didn't go anywhere when AI came along. It just became the training ground for AI. And it's interesting that the workers who are being squeezed out of knowledge jobs are selling their voices and their movements to build the systems that squeeze them out. Because where do a lot of these people who are being laid off because of AI go? Well, they go drive for Uber, they go drive for DoorDash. And you do that long enough and you get really accustomed to the idea that they send you a task and you go do that task and you get paid for it. So if that task shifts from picking up a meal at a restaurant and delivering it to somebody's house to going to your own house and washing your dishes, because that's what they want to capture the video of, it's the same thing. You're getting a task on the app, you're doing the task, and you're getting paid for it. So I think for a lot of people, this is going to be a fairly easy shift, and they're not going to think a lot about what's happening to the information and the content that's being created with their movements and their voices that is now being shared and used to make a lot of money for the people who are paying a pittance to these folks. So I see three issues here that connect directly to organizational communication. And the first is consent and transparency. And I'm talking about inside organizations, because companies are already deploying AI tools trained on data that their own workers have supplied. And sometimes they've supplied this data unknowingly. So, the ethical and reputational questions that employees are going to ask are questions like, was my voice used to train a bot that you activated in order to replace my friend who sat next to me and I had lunch with? And regulators are going to end up asking these questions too. So communicators really need to be out front with this clear internal messaging about what data employees generate and how the company is using it. Let's talk about that before I hit the other two things that popped into my mind about this.
Yeah. I mean, I think the transparency element is key. I think that's not because of this. That's not a new thing. That's always been the case. I believe that's an important aspect to it. I think how should organizations communicate this is maybe not as simple as it might seem to that question. The answer may not be simple. I think much depends on, the example you mentioned, I think is an interesting one. A company uses data from its employees unwittingly to them to do something. Well, that's easy. Don't do it like that. Don't do that. You need to disclose if you're doing this. Surely that is an ethical issue in my view, that if you don't tell them and you go ahead and do that, that's not what you should be doing, I don't believe. So there's an easy one to address, I think. So the other element to do that, which is ethics related to that, is this whole thing ethical? if participation is driven by economic necessity. Like, oh, well, we have to do this because we need to get the edge on the competition or whatever it might be, whatever reason you might give. You're still up against that element. That's ethics, the big picture, if you like, but the common sense, how you should do this. Related, should individuals be compensated long term for use of their data? So
You mean like as if they're licensing it?
well, yeah, I mean, you fine. On the one hand, we might say, yeah, okay, fine. Let's tell everyone we're using, your data might be used as an employee in the organization, your day-to-day interactions with your colleagues, etc. And we might use that data, the recordings of your conversations that you use on our internal Teams tool, that's kept. So you, the employee, might say, I'm okay with that. I want to be compensated for it, though. And now there's an interesting position.
Well, the organization might retort, you are being paid for it. You're being paid a salary. You come in here every day. You do your work. Read your employment agreement.
Okay.
This is kind of like, what was it? Was it Velcro or Post-it notes? Maybe both of them, where the person who invented it never made a penny off the royalties because they were an employee of the company and the work product belonged to the company. I think organizations might be able to make the same argument here.
They could. It's like, if they could, but I'm trying to get the rhyming right here. I'm not sure whether they should, just because they could, because the climate is very different today to those examples back in the 60s. So I think there's a more likelihood. So you've got to think about things like, if we don't do this, are we going to get an exodus of employees who are going to go to work for a company who treats them better than we do in that same context? So you've got issues like this, I believe.
Well, now you have the economic environment and the hiring situation where a lot of companies are trying to avoid hiring. They're also trying to avoid firing, layoffs, but they're trying to avoid hiring. It's pretty flat out there right now. It's definitely a buyer's market. So I don't know that, I would leave an organization because they're using my data unless I already had another job lined up.
I agree.
Because they're hard to find right now.
I mean, it's slightly hypothetical, the scenario, but I think it is worth recognizing that could well be. It's like already from the research on those articles, but also some other stuff that I saw too, there's already a strong imbalance of value and control between the individuals who provide the data and the companies who are getting that data and making economic use out of it. AI companies, particularly AI companies, rely on real world human data already because of data scarcity. So it's kind of like the kind of threat, the challenge on both sides of the argument here. They need the data. There's probably a finite use for employees providing that data. They've got to look elsewhere too. But the thing is that there's not this new economies emerging, it seems to me, where people monetize their identity and behavior voluntarily. In the case of the examples we heard about the guy in Uganda walking down, filming himself walking. And then the flip of that, as I mentioned, the example of young people in America, The Guardian has a really, really good analysis of this, who have skills that cannot be easily at all translated into, an AI can do that. But the key element in that part of the discussion was about, and this example they used was a good one, that the skill this young guy has, 23 years old, is not unique, but he's got a skill that isn't just, I know how to repair a diesel engine. He can, at a glance, literally see what's wrong and already formulate the 6 things he needs to do and how to fix it. He knows how to do that. And that is valuable. So he knows his value. And then the example of this guy, he's earning $150,000 a year already in salary doing this. And he's 23 years old, and that's his skill. So there's other examples mentioned in that Guardian piece too that are interesting. So on the one hand, you've got, I guess I joined together 2 separate issues with that example, but it is part of, let's say, this new economic model that's emerging. On the one hand, you've got the gig economy workers like DoorDash drivers doing the stuff they're doing and others. And on the other hand, you've got people like this guy developing a career that is not related to AI at all. He's got a skill that cannot easily be done by an AI. So that's part of the landscape, let's say. So I'm not sure where all that fits within this shell, to be honest, but it's part of the picture.
I think it was MIT came out with a report not too long ago that made the point that they said something like 93% of jobs are AI safe. And there were a lot of people out there saying, well, this really paints a different picture from what we've been anticipating. I don't know how accurate it is. But in the meantime, there are AI companies that are working very hard to elevate these systems to the point where they can do some of the work that currently might be considered AI safe. I mean, I think that for many jobs is probably just a temporary thing. I raised the issue of employees inside the organization. Those gig workers are another issue for organizational communicators, because these workers, the ones that I mentioned before, that you were talking about, the ones who are very accustomed to having the app, it tells them do this task, they go do the task, and a payment for it shows up. These folks aren't covered by traditional internal communications. So, or organizations who are relying on gig workers, contracted labor, and increasingly, if your AI tools were trained by them, you have a stakeholder relationship that you may not have a communication strategy for. I'd argue that you don't have a communication strategy for. But I've often made the distinction between internal communications and employee communications. Employees are the people who come in and get paid by you directly, whether it's salaried or hourly. But you have other internal stakeholders, and we develop strategies for them. The contractors who are embedded in our organization. I work in construction. We have subcontractors. There's ways that the organization communicates with them. There are all kinds of internal stakeholders, and these gig workers and contract workers are now among them. And we should figure out a way to communicate with them and talk about our ethical use of their data and engage with them in ways that are meaningful and useful and produce positive results.
Yeah, makes sense. You had two other points you're going to mention too.
Just one other, actually, and
okay.
that's about keeping the human in the loop, because, a lot of companies, in order to feel good and look good as they move into the AI world, are positioning human oversight as really important. But what the stories we've been talking about reveal is that humans are raw material, physically, biometrically, behaviorally, and workers in the age category 22 to 25 in the most AI exposed occupations, things like paralegals, for example, they've experienced a 13% decline in employment since 2022, which is the year that OpenAI released ChatGPT to the public. On the other hand, employment for less exposed or more experienced workers, think about your 23-year-old in the US, that's been steady, or in some cases even increasing. So organizational communicators talking about AI is just augmenting human workers. We need to be careful about that, because I think increasingly we're going to hear stories about how that isn't actually true, particularly for this younger demographic. We have to be true about that asymmetry. I mean, whose labor is augmenting whom,
Yeah, I get that. That does make sense. It's a story. It's an issue embracing communications, ethics, and trust more than anything. But at the heart of it, there is the technology aspect to it. I'm just thinking about other things that you and I have discussed in previous episodes that are kind of adjacent to this issue, where if you analyze what are the real issues, they tend to be a mixture of communication, ethics, and trust. So that's a good starting point for communicators who might be wondering, well, how the hell do I address this? Where do I start with this? There's your start: communication, ethics, and trust. Work out how you can, in a sense, develop the process, the procedures, if you like, that embrace those, recognize the importance of those things that you can execute, if you like, inside the organization. But I'm thinking it is a big picture. I agree with the premise in all the articles that there are links in the show notes, that a new data labor economy is emerging, where people monetize their identity and their behavior and don't think twice about it. In the case of the global south in particular, not so much the global north, such as a 3-year-old in the US is earning 6 figures a year, and others like that the company or employers, I would say, have a duty of care, if you will, to recognize what they need to do to bring in that group into their structure, where communication, ethics, and trust play the bigger role.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a number of places to look. You don't want to be the next organization to have it disclosed that you have slave labor producing the data that you need, because those scandals were pretty difficult for the fashion companies that went through them. Also, one of the things that the generative AI models are really good for is scenario planning. And for your organization in your industry with your markets, it wouldn't hurt to do some scenario planning about who those stakeholders are that you should be communicating with, and what the challenges are going to be both internally and externally, and start developing some communication strategies.
Yeah,
And
good advice.
that'll be a 30 for this episode of For Immediate Release.